I think it's really neat that you're having this meeting at an Outback Steakhouse. When I was in college and would come home, my mom's favorite place to eat was Outback, so it was always a big deal to be at the Outback Steakhouse. I thank you, Teresa, for the introduction. It's great to be with so many people that I've known over the years and to talk a little bit about this race for Secretary of State. What I'd like to do in the time I have with you is to tell you a little bit about myself personally for those of you who don't know me. I'd like to tell you a little bit about why I'm running for Secretary of State, what we hope to accomplish, and why I think I'm your best choice in the May 22nd Republican primary. I also want to thank you, Teresa, for not making me follow Michael McNeely. I really appreciate that. And I'll be cognizant of the fact y'all are going to be hearing from him shortly. So my background, my family moved to Columbus, Georgia because my great-grandfather had a job opportunity. He was hired at the Eagle and Phoenix Textile Mill in Columbus. He worked in that mill for 50 years. My grandfather dropped out of school in the 8th grade during the Great Depression to help take care of our family, worked a lot of different odd jobs until World War II broke out. He enlisted in the Army, served in the Pacific until the war ended. He came home, he married my grandmother who worked at commercial printers in Columbus. After the war, he was a railroad conductor, he was a milkman, did a couple other things until they got up enough money to open a little grocery store at 5th Avenue and 8th Street in downtown Columbus. They had a lot of small businesses over the years. They had a filling station, they had another grocery store. One of my earliest childhood memories is helping my granddad refill the Coca-Cola machine at the laundromat, which was the last small business they owned and operated. But they were very entrepreneurial people. My dad was the first member of our family that went to college. He went to Auburn University. He worked at that same Eagle and Phoenix textile mill in the summertime to earn tuition to pay for college. He went on to law school. He's practiced law for the last 40 years, and I followed in Dad's footsteps. I went to Furman University. And I feel like you need to get the bad stuff out of the way early, so I'm going to go ahead and tell you I went to law school at the University of Alabama. I know. But they tell you get that stuff out right away, you know. And then I came home to Columbus. I've practiced law there the last 14 years, and I've been in the state Senate for the last 7 years. This is actually my 8th year in the General Assembly. And I tell y'all all of that first to give you a sense of who I am, where I come from, but also to say, you know, my family's really been able to live our American dream. We've been able to sort of set our own course, go after our dreams and achieve those dreams. And what has animated my interest in public service, being a Republican Party chairman, running for the state Senate, has been, I think it is getting harder for the average person to achieve their American dream. And I think that the primary obstacle for people is a government that has gotten too big and gotten in their way. And I think it is our role and responsibility to roll back that government, to get it out of the way so people can achieve their American dream. So why am I running for Secretary of State? If you don't remember anything else I tell you today, I hope you'll remember this. I'm running for Secretary of State to accomplish two things. I want to make Georgia the fastest state in the nation to get a job and the toughest state in the nation to cast an illegal vote. It's really just that simple. That's what we want to accomplish in the Secretary of State's office. Now, people ask all the time, well, what is it about jobs in the Secretary of State's office? How do those two things even really connect? I thought all the Secretary of State did was handle elections. Well, in fact, there are 41 licensed professions in our state, everything from barbers and cosmetologists to funeral directors and optometrists and a lot of things in between. And the number one job of your Secretary of State, in my opinion, is to look for ways to streamline our licensing to connect people to the dignity of honest, hard work. Now, if you think about it, 40 years ago, fewer than 1 in 20 Americans had to go get a permission slip or a license from government to go to work. Today, it's more than 1 in 4 that have to do that. I think the pendulum has swung too far in the direction of regulation. And I'll just give you a couple quick examples of what I mean. You might not know this, but in the state of Georgia, we license librarians. Now, I want you to think about that. The reason we have state licenses are for public health and public safety reasons. Now, if tomorrow we could wave a wand down there at the General Assembly and stop issuing license to librarians, I submit to you there would not be a public health or public safety crisis, right? But somewhere along the line, somebody thought that was a good idea and we just did it. Government left unchecked just continues to grow. So you need somebody in the Secretary of State's office who's going to ask those questions and say, do we really need, is this something that somebody needs a permission slip from government to go do? Cosmetology. Cosmetology license holders have a license to cut and color hair and do nails, essentially. That's what that license entitles you to do. In our state, on average, you spend 350 days in training before you receive that license. Now, by comparison, an EMT license holder, this is the person who's rendering life-saving aid in the case of a medical emergency, on average receives 31 days of training. Now, I'm telling you, there is something wrong with the system where there's 10 times the training required to get that license to cut and color hair and do nails as there is to render life-saving aid. Does that mean we shouldn't have a license? No, there's clearly a public health and public safety interest there. But perhaps there are better ways that we can streamline that process. Maybe there are opportunities for apprenticeship programs. Maybe there are opportunities for tiered licenses so that somebody can get to work and get started. You know, in our state, we talk about our state being the #1 state to do business, and that's a great thing. But what we really mean when we say that is our state is the #1 place for Fortune 500 companies to locate in Atlanta. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But for the average person reaching for that first rung on the ladder of economic success, things are getting harder, not easier. Our state over the last 15 years has seen our proportion of low-income families increase while our proportion of middle-income families has decreased. And we need to try to reverse that trend. And one way we can do it is make it easier for people to get to work. One other thing about licensure that I think is really important for people to understand. The licensing boards regulate these professions. We have 170,000 nurses in this state. Did you know that when a complaint is made against a nurse, say for example someone who has a substance abuse problem and has mishandled a patient, that the investigation time on those cases is taking 400 days on average? And during that time, that person continues to be licensed. They continue to be able to work on patients. Now, I'm not saying every person that receives a complaint needs to lose their license, but we need to resolve those cases much faster. There are 550 open cases right now that are under the Board of Nursing. We've got to do a better job of speeding that process up and getting to a resolution so that person can move on with their life, and if there is a risk to public health, that it's dealt with. So those things aren't things that you're going to hear probably in a 30-second commercial, but I think they're extremely important. Now let's talk about elections for a few moments, because that is the thing that I think most people think about when they think about the Secretary of State's office. We need to do everything we can to make sure people have confidence in our elections and that people aren't able to cheat the system when it comes to casting votes. So there are a couple of different things on this issue. Number one is our technology that we use to vote. I'm assuming everyone in this room is a pretty regular voter. So if you vote on election day or you vote in person early, you go vote on these touchscreen machines that were first put in service about 15 years ago. They're coming to the end of their usable life cycle. That's what the manufacturer told the state when we made this purchase. We're going to have to migrate over to some sort of new technology. There are only 5 states in the country other than Georgia that have fully electronic voting. And there's a good reason for that. There's no way to audit or verify the result of an election on these machines. We had a mayoral election in Atlanta, y'all may have heard a little bit about. Almost 100,000 votes, 700 vote margin separating the two candidates. One of the candidates asked for a recount. All they do is run a software program again. There's no copy of your ballot that someone can inspect because that isn't produced by the machine. So what we need is a process that is paper-based, that is verifiable, that we can audit so you have confidence in the election result. And if and when we need to do a recount, there's an actual physical ballot to count. That's really, really important. And that's something I'm going to plan on working with the legislature and local boards of elections to make sure that happens. Now, what about other threats to voting process. You have to present an ID when you vote early. You have to present an ID when you vote on election day. But if you cast an absentee ballot, there is no voter ID requirement that goes along with that. You can pencil in your driver's license number, and that's about it on the application. You're not having to submit that government-issued photo ID. And people say, particularly on the left, well, there's no voter fraud. You know, there's nothing to be concerned about. In my home county, in Muskogee County, a few years ago, we had a woman come down to the elections office with 19 absentee ballots that she was trying to turn in. And just as it so happened, a good friend of mine, U.D. Roberts, who's on our election board, happened to be there and said, hey, wait a minute, what are you doing with these 19 ballots? And she said, well, I work at this nursing home in Columbus, and I'm just doing this as a service to the residents. So they separated out those 19 ballots. They conducted an investigation. They found that of the 19 residents, 15 could not sign their name or make their mark. I mean, they were mentally just not there. And yet someone had sent in an application for a ballot, and someone had filled out that ballot. And here's a spoiler alert for you, they were not voting for Republicans, okay? So we've got to do some things to tighten up our absentee ballot process. The other thing we've really got to do is we got to deal with legal threats being made, lawsuits that are being filed, challenging Georgia election law. You know, this past summer, there was a congressional election in the metropolitan Atlanta area with Karen Handel and John Ossoff. Maybe y'all saw a few of those television advertisements. But you know, the folks on the far left spent over $30 million trying to flip that seat. They filed a lot of lawsuits too. They challenged our voter registration law, got the window changed for voter registration so that in the middle of the election, 10,000 new voters were added to the rolls. There's no time to verify that those people are who they say they are, they're eligible to vote. We can't allow a single federal judge to change Georgia election law. That's why you need an election lawyer, somebody who has litigated these matters in court like me, to be your Secretary of State. Because I'm not just going to surrender because a single federal judge tells me to do so. That's why we have a Court of Appeals, that's why we have a U.S. Supreme Court. And if the far left, if George Soros, if these other outside groups are trying to change our law through the courts because they can't do it in the legislature, that's where they're going to have to take me for us to change anything in our election law, because we have to defend the position taken by the Georgia General Assembly. One last point on lawsuits. There have been lawsuits filed all over this state by groups trying to force counties and cities to print ballots in languages other than English. And I want to congratulate the Hall County Board of Elections for having a real leadership this week of rescinding a decision to print ballots in other languages than English. But they need a partner in the Secretary of State's office, because the theory that these far left groups are operating under is, well, if we go sue a city or county with limited financial resources, they'll give up rather than have to pay the lawyers. And that's why, as your Secretary of State, I'm going to go to the legislature and I'm going to ask for funding to be able to stand beside counties and cities facing these issues so that we can help with the legal defense of those kinds of claims. Because if that happens in a single Georgia county or city, it affects the entire state. The integrity of our electoral process is too important to leave to chance. So let me wrap up my remarks by telling you why I think I'm your best choice in the May 22nd Republican primary. There are a number of people running for this office in the Republican primary. They're all good people. I think that there are a couple of reasons that I stand out from that crowd. One I've mentioned to you already. I'm the only one running with a background in election law. I've litigated ballot access cases. I've litigated election contests. I know Georgia election law inside and out. Serving on the Senate Regulated Industries Committee, I understand these licensing issues I talked to you about earlier this morning. I'm not going to need on-the-job training. I can walk into the office on day one and do the job. That's very important. The other thing that's important is the Democrats, with all due respect to the other offices that are going to be on the ballot, the premier Democrat on the statewide ballot in November is going to be former Congressman John Barrow, who will be their nominee for Secretary of State. John Barrow, who voted for Nancy Pelosi for Speaker, who voted with President Obama 85% of the time while he was in Congress. Who do you want on the debate stage with John Barrow? Do you want someone who has never had to engage in a serious debate with a very talented member of the far left, or do you want somebody who's been doing this for years? I think that's a clear reason that I need to be your choice in the May primary. And the last thing I would say to you is this: you've got to have someone who is going to stand up once they're elected. You know, people can come to you at a meeting like this and tell you all the right things, but the best indicator of how somebody's going to behave in the future is how they've behaved in the past. And in my last 7 years in the state Senate, and Teresa kind of referenced it in her introduction, I've had plenty of choices to do the thing that was politically expedient or easy, or do the thing that might have been a little bit harder but was the right thing to do. Your Secretary of State will be Secretary of State in November of 2020 when President Trump is on the ballot for re-election. They spent $30 million and filed multiple lawsuits to try to flip one of our 14 congressional seats. Imagine what they're going to do to move Georgia's 16 electoral votes into the Elizabeth Warren or Cory Booker column in November of 2020. You need a bulldog. You need someone who's going to stand up and fight for the integrity of our electoral process. And I submit to you, I'm that person. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate your vote in the May 22nd primary.